Hey everybody, this is Pioneer John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another quick deck overview. This time a deck that has started to see a little bit of play in both Pioneer and Explorer, and that is Boros Pia. Now this deck is a variation of Mono Red or Boros Heroic or Boros Convoke. It's kind of in the vein of all those decks, but does things a little bit differently. So this version is a little bit grindier. Has a lot of redraws in the form of Ren's Resolve, Reckless Impulse, and Showdown of the Scalds. This means this deck theoretically should almost never run out of gas, which is kind of unique for a red deck. The downside of it is, though, is much like an Izzet spell-based deck in both Pioneer and to a more extent Modern, you do have some air in the deck. Much like Izzet Phoenix, you're playing a lot of spells, just kind of churning through your deck. Whereas your opponent can kind of pick off your threats one at a time, but you do see such an overwhelming number of cards that oftentimes this deck can just overwhelm a traditional Rakdos mid-range deck or something along those lines. Basically, it is Red's answer to grindy mid-range decks. That said, you still have the early aggressive starts of things like Monastery Swift Spear, Soulscar Mage, Kamano faces Kakuzan, and then you're pairing it with the grind engine of Pia Nolar, with whenever you play a land or a spell from exile, you get a bunch of Thopters, and then, you're already playing the card advantage spells, and then you get to play something like Bone Crusher Giant, which is both a split removal spell or doming the face, and can be a 4/3 giant, and if you happen to play both sides, you get a 1/1 Thopter if Pia is in play as you're playing the Bone Crusher Giant out of exile. So, a lot of nice synergies built into this deck overall. The rest of the deck, bunch of red-white duels, and then some number of mountains. Nothing too exciting land-based, not a whole lot of man lands as you do need your color requirements. Chain to the Rocks is a nice removal spell. Play with Fire as an early removal spell for mana dorks, early opponent's creatures, as well as going face and getting a little bit of card selection with the Scry. The sideboard is a smattering of removal spells and a little bit of disruption for controlling decks. So you see things like Portable Hole and Destroy Evil to deal with various different creatures. Portable Hole, obviously, much like Play with Fire, deals with the early creatures while also hitting things like Wolfwillow Haven. Destroy Evil blows up more expensive enchantments, things like Fires, Enigmatic Incarnation, while also dealing with things like Omnath or Shieldred, which a red deck typically has problems with, outside of a card like Chain to the Rocks. Downside of Chain to the Rocks, if it gets blown up, the creature comes back. The rest of the sideboard, one copy of Rest in Peace helps to fight against the Izzet spell decks like Izzet Phoenix and also against Greasefang. Rending Volley, once again, another situational removal spell. Comes in against spirits and humans and angels and Greasefang combo. And then, a couple copies of Invasion of Gabakan. This is kind of a Elite Spellbinder-esque effect. Puts attacks on the card that you remove. While also, if you attack it down the flip side, it starts pumping your team that's attacked and also makes it more difficult for non-exile-based sweepers to kill your team, whether that be, Deafening Clarion, Supreme Verdict, those kind of things. You are still vulnerable to something like Farewell, but Farewell is a 6-mana sweeper, so it should catch anything. And then Redain helps to slow down your opponent, especially if they're reliant on expensive sorcerers and instants. So, Blue-White Control, Lotus Field Combo, Azorius Lotus Field, Niv to Late, any of those kind of decks that are relying on expensive sorceries and instants to resolve. Does not slow down expensive creatures like Mono Green, but can slow down something like Karn Mono Green, but is more there for the spell-based decks. And then finally, get to play a copy of Giganta. Don't leave home without it. Second version, now this is a little bit hard to find lists for this deck, primarily because it isn't clearly defined on things like MTG Goldfish and such. So this is actually an Explorer list, so I'm not sure this is, the best variant of the deck to look at, but you're still looking at a lot of the same cards. Monastery Swift Spear. This version plays a little bit more in the removal spell game. You're playing Vindictive Flamestoker, which is a 1/2. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Vindictive Flamestoker. 6 in a red, sacrifice Vindictive Flamestoker, discard your hand, and draw 4 cards. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each oil counter on Vindictive Flamestoker. This is very much like a Bomat Courier-esque effect that gets cheaper as you obviously play spells. So it does have the issue of if you can't hold the mana, then your opponent can remove it before you get the advantage off of it. But it's another one of those things that kind of plays into the churning thing while being an easy 1-drop to play. Fiery Impulse is not play with fire, but it is a little bit better at dealing with your opponent's creatures. One of Spikefield Hazard is a land/spell that helps to trigger your various different things. Springleaf Drum allows you to take advantage of the creatures you're generating off of Pia, and sometimes your 1-drops as they come into play to get a little bit more burst on mana, while also having another cheap spell to play. Ossification is kind of Chain of the Rocks adjacent. The only positive with it is technically you don't have to have a mountain in play, but since you're only playing basic mountains anyway, I'm not sure Chain of the Rocks isn't better, but since this list is from Explore, Ossification is probably the choice they had to go with from that format, as Chain of the Rocks is not legal there. Rest of the deck, very similar to what we'd seen, Showdown of the Skalds, Pia Nalar, Ren's Resolve, Reckless Impulse. The two differences, Runaway Steamkin allows you to play more of kind of a combo churn thing, allowing you for every 3 spells you cast, other than Ossification, to get 3 mana, continue the cycle, get a bunch of lands, or get a bunch of mana. Allows you to really chain out and kind of become more of this pseudo combo deck. And then Voldaren Thrillseeker is a way to, if you're pumping your team with Showdown of the Skalds, or possibly a Runaway Steamkin, just throw it at your opponent and kind of dome them for a lot of damage. So this is more kind of a combo-based or churning-based, much like the old Runaway Steamkin Experimental Frenzy decks used to be. Very much in the vein of that. Just kind of allows you to get away from kind of a grindy mid-range deck and just become this kind of pseudo combo deck in addition to being just a normal red-white aggro deck. Sideboard, forgot to talk about Alpine Moon in the previous look at the other version of the deck. Alpine Moon primarily here for Nykthos and Lotus Field. Helps to slow down the mana production of those. Running Volley. The rest of the cards we've already kind of talked about, as they are a lot of the same. Faithful Absence, just a nice clean removal spell. And you get to play Gigantha. So where does this deck excel in comparison to other variants of red-white? Convoke, a little bit better against spot removal. This version is a little bit better at grinding against the mid-range decks. Convoke is more explosive. This version is a little bit, like I said, the grindier version. So both decks have about a turn 4, turn 4.5 key window. But this deck is more about just grinding through removal, continuing to stay in the game against decks like Blue-White Control, Rakdos Midrange, those kind of things. Whereas Convoke is much better against the more linear decks like Greasefang and Mono Green. So it's a matter of, do you want a grindier deck, or do you want a deck that's a little bit better at being explosive, kind of the variants of Boros that are being played right now. Burn is not really a thing in the format. You do have Mono Red Aggro, which is part burn, part this. But that deck is largely faded as Rakdos Midrange has come into vogue over the last year or so. And then when you also pair it with Rakdos Sacrifice, traditional Burn just doesn't have the staying power without things like Lightning Bolt. Even things like Lava Spike or Rift Bolt, you're playing with a lot worse burn spells. No Lightning Helix even, so you're kind of left with this weird amalgamation of part prowess, part burn, and it just doesn't seem like it's holding up. And then you do have like the Mono Red variants with like Annex of the Forge, Torbrand, those kind of things. This deck is kind of somewhere in that vein, somewhere in between Mono Red Aggro and some, a red-white mid-range deck. So, it's a deck that basically doesn't run out of gas, but is a little bit slower, so it doesn't quite kill quite as quickly and can be problematic in decks where speed is key. You do have interaction for things like Greasefang combo, and you can slow down Mono Green a little bit, but you are a little bit worse in kind of those, just pure gold fishing matchups. So, hence why you see cards kind of targeted toward those matchups. But this is another variant of red aggro that you should be aware of in the format. And if you like this kind of Pioneer content, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Hope to see you for our next video.